Hey everybody, it's your old pal John. I hope you're all doing well. You can call me the History Buff, you can call me John, call me whatever you want. Please keep the comments respectful, which I know almost everyone does, and that's great. But today we have the top 10 historical facts that aren't true. So generally I find that they're not true alone when Simon talks, but I've only seen a couple of his videos, and I stopped and I kind of, this one was suggested, and I thought, okay, let's see what's going on. Let's just get into it. Let me know what you thought was true, what you thought wasn't true. That would be pretty cool.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Top 10's Net, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 historical facts that aren't actually true. Number 10. Columbus was the first European to discover America. While this old belief has been largely expunged from the historical record today, at one point it was believed as a fact by generations of schoolchildren and is still maintained as true by some adults even today. Of course, the truth is that the Vikings preceded Columbus by centuries and may have even built small villages in the New World hundreds of years before Columbus was born. Even if that weren't the case, however, from a purely technical perspective, Columbus never actually touched foot onto what is today the United States, spending all of his time in the East Indies.
Okay, yeah, there are a couple things with that. First of all, the Vikings, yes, if you're from Great Britain, well, you certainly know your history with that. And they certainly went further, and they went into what is like Canada. I don't know if they got as far as Maine in the United States, but there were definitely some settlements there that we know. We've unearthed some, and just to make it 100% true, people don't just say, yeah, here it is, or we're pretty sure. They have to be 100% sure. But we do know that there were at least people there. The settlement question is kind of out. They did not reach the United States. Columbus did not reach the United States, by the way. I believe on all 4 journeys he didn't reach the United States. But, when you talk about Americas, I mean, that's the Caribbean or the Caribbean, depending on where you're from. Nothing there. As a matter of fact, the Chinese or the Peloponnesians, actually, that's what it was. They actually made it to the Peruvian eras. Although, of course, that was not the modern world where they brought back information. You can give Columbus, I guess, credit because he did bring back the information to what is a new modern world post Black Plague or Black Death, I guess it's called. And thus it's a more communicative world. In the Viking Age, it wasn't exactly that much. However, also there had been Irish fishermen that had actually I believe that talked about a cape. It was ended up being called Cape Cod in Massachusetts, in one of the New England states, and they had fished off there before. And the idea was that they wanted to keep it kind of a secret, and it was seen as like a myth, whatever. But it was actually that they had fished that far out, which is really crazy.
Number 9. People in Columbus's time thought that the world was flat. Closely related to the belief that Columbus discovered America is the belief, again less prevalent today than it was half a century ago, that most people in his day believed the Earth was flat, and if Columbus sailed too far out, he would fall off its edge. In reality, the notion that the Earth was flat had been refuted by the ancient Greeks, who were even able to calculate its circumference with astonishing precision, and so was not held to be a fact by any but the most primitive cultures at the time.
Okay, well, we're on the topic of that. I think only maybe the uneducated probably believe that may have been the case, but I'm sure it was not an everyday conversation if you were poor or didn't have an education. It was pretty much disproved. And while we're on the case of Columbus, just to give you a heads up, this idea of Columbus is kind of a rewrite of history. Just to give you a side note, here in the States, we talk about our education system being not great. This was something to give Italian immigrants something to sort of rally around. And that's largely my understanding of where the Columbus holiday came from. And we don't have it anymore, but again, I don't think anyone believes that Columbus discovered the world. But anyway, those are my 2 points. They're kind of the same ones.
Number 8. Hitler seized power in Germany by force. Many people hold
No.
the misconception that the Nazis seized power in Germany, but nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is that the Nazis came to power through free and fair elections, and even used the democratic process to secure that power. In effect, Adolf Hitler, appealing to the very legitimate grievances and fears of the German people, used the ballot box to achieve the powerful position of Chancellor, and then used that very same process to destroy democracy by having the legislature grant him the emergency powers he convinced them was necessary to restore order.
That's so true. A lot of people who do discuss World War II or like to learn about World War II, they don't take the time to realize that they just think, okay, Hitler blamed the Jews and that's how he got into power. Well, okay, that's very oversimplified. We could go on for hours, but in like 1928, well, there was the beer hall push with Ludendorff, then 1920, and that started the whole Nazi movement after, after that. I mean, not started, but, kind of put them on the map. 1928, the first elections were really held with the Nazi Party, and they got like 2 point something. It was under 3, but it was like 2.6, 2.7%. Article 40 something, 40, 48, 49. I think it was 48. That sounds right. Basically said that all new laws didn't have to be approved by the Reichstag. 1930, there was an election. The Nazis got 18% of the votes, I think. I hope I'm right there. Then in like 1931, because these elections were like every 6-month elections, 1931, they were at like 36 or 37% of it, and they actually had the majority because there were so many. There were a couple different groups, and at the end it was like the communists essentially versus the Nazis, and that was a thing. So then there was like Poppin and gosh, I can't remember his name, Schleider. I think that was Schleider was in power, and the whole idea was that at this point, when you didn't have to have laws ratified by the Reichstag, you're essentially a step away from dictatorship. All you have to do is make a law, and then you have the chancellor and the president, and then I can't forget the guy's name. I want to say Bloomberg, but that's not right. He was the president of Germany up until 1933 when he died, and Hitler was like vice chancellor, and then president and chancellor became basically the same, and that's basically how Hitler came into power. I mean, we look at it in terms of there's a lot of physical violence and stuff like that, but when it came to the ballot box, they were legitimately held elections.
Number 7. The stock market crash of 1929 started the Great Depression. Of all the misconceptions...
Oh, and by the way, the Reichstag was burned, so that was another thing. I think that was used, if I'm not mistaken, as the catalyst to give Hitler the emergency powers. That's still in question, but I don't know. You can read between the lines.
Surrounding that dark era in American history, the idea that the crash of October 1929 kicked off the Great Depression is the most obstinate. The fact is that the Great Depression was caused by a number of factors, each of which went into making it a deeper and more enduring economic downturn than it would have been otherwise. Instead of letting the market make its own corrections and wait it out, they passed legislation, such as the Smoot-Hawley Act, that raised tariffs on imports, which was designed to make it cheaper to buy American products. The problem is they didn't anticipate that foreign governments would raise tariffs on American goods in response, thereby killing exports and forcing the mass closure of many factories. Bad government policies also caused many banks to fail, wiping out the life savings of millions of Americans, which further exacerbated the problem. Number 6.
Yeah, the stock market crash is just an easy way to teach people and say, look, you can point to one thing and say, look, that started it. And that's easy for history to do. As always, as is everything, even in your own homes, it's not just one thing that you can point to that makes things happen. There's a whole lot that goes into this. So I mean, I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but no, there were first of all a number of different crashes that happened, but there were also a number of different things that went in that didn't help the situation. And that's just the way it goes.
Japan had to attack America if it wanted to survive economically. The belief that Japan was largely forced into attacking the United States because of the crippling embargo America had imposed upon it in response to its aggression in China is debatable. Japan had two options available to her other than attacking the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. First, it could have negotiated an end to her 4-year-long war with China, which Japan was unwilling to do, or it could have simply seized the oil and mineral riches of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, and the Malay Peninsula directly without involving America at all. Consider for a moment that if the US was unwilling to go to war in Europe to assist Great Britain in its struggle with Nazi Germany, what were the chances Congress could have been persuaded to take on the Japanese over the Dutch East Indies and Malaysia? Number 5.
Okay, yeah. So one thing to note, and guys, I realize this is more American based and the audience is more Great Britain based or British based. So, bear with me and let me know what you think, because I see right now where we're going. But yeah, let me know what you think about these. Did you believe these were true, or are you learning something new? Japan and in the U.S. during while World War II was going on, the U.S. was very much against, as was many of the Allied powers amongst other countries, were very much against the Japanese invasion into Manchuria, actually starting, with, in Manchuria and then the all-out war, more like 1937. And it was something that we didn't like. It was the militarist wars that Japan was getting into. And the states were very isolationist. And we were in negotiations. And many people don't believe this or don't understand this, but we were in negotiations with Japan to stop these wars that they were doing. We tried to do things peacefully while there was a world war going on. Some would say foolhardily, but then other people say that it was sort of a way to get into the war for the people who wanted to get into the war. But the truth of the matter is we did put an oil embargo on them, and that was the vast majority of the oil that they used. And so the fact that they had to attack or not, they very well could have sued for peace and backed down. And that was the stance, of the states at the time. But they decided not to. They had many options. They did have many options. So it was not like they were forced into it. That's history. That's history kind of just pointing to one event. If Lee had won...
If Lee had won at Gettysburg, the South would have won the Civil War.
No,
not at all. It is widely believed that the Union victory at Gettysburg in July of 1863 prevented the North from complete collapse, but a careful look at the overall strategic situation at the time demonstrates this to have been unlikely. First, even if Lee had routed Meade's army at Gettysburg, they would have come at considerable cost, especially considering the number of Union troops Lee faced, over 90,000 compared to his own 70,000 men. This means that even if he had been victorious, Lee would have emerged from the battle with a largely exhausted and depleted force left with which to march on Washington almost 100 miles away. Additionally, Gettysburg would have been only the first in a string of obstacles he would have had to overcome as he moved east. Eventually, he would have to retreat back into Virginia in any case, and though he could add another Confederate victory to the long list of victories Lee had enjoyed up to that point in the war, the South simply couldn't match the North's almost unlimited industrial capability and was doomed to eventually lose in any case.
All right, to the Great Britain. Great Britain, I keep saying this, to the British fans who are watching the show and who have made it this far. First of all, I don't think they would have won the war without European intervention. So, and at this point, it was already kind of a done deal that it really wasn't going to happen. So there is that. Now, Gettysburg, sort of like the people call it the turning point in the Civil War. I don't believe that personally. I believe that Vicksburg was, because it's the big stranglehold. It's like when someone finally gets their hands around your throat, and then it's just a matter of time. I do believe that. But there were other obstacles. They wouldn't have gotten to Washington. Washington was like the most fortified. It was the most fortified city in the world, I believe, at that time. And they wouldn't have had the troops to go through. It was no. But I mean, if you look at it, that's sort of the high watermark of the Confederacy. That's what they call it. There's really, I don't see it as a major turning point. It's just the first major victory. It was two people slugging it out, and it was a Pyrrhic victory. So did you know that? Did you not? I don't know.
Before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. Most students grow up believing that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, but it did no such thing. First of all, it only applied to slaves living within the Confederate States, and since the North had no power to enforce the proclamation in those territories not under its direct control, it really had no immediate effect on freeing anyone. In fact, it didn't even free those slaves in the northern states, where slave ownership, while uncommon, was still legal. It was only illegal to buy and sell slaves in the North, not own them. It would take the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, to do that, and it applied throughout the country, not just parts of it.
Okay, yes, and I know we're going to talk about in the future and about Great Britain and the slave trade, and that was, I believe, the very key moral event and a big thing in British history. That's actually world history. That's more important. However, this particular one was a huge fight over it. And the Emancipation Proclamation basically said anyone held in bondage in the rebel territories, okay, the ones that are in rebellion, they are free. So the whole point is that, you're talking parts of Virginia, some of Tennessee, not in Kentucky necessarily. They didn't rebel, so they could still have slavery in the areas that didn't rebel, and there were places in the North that had slavery. But you're looking at all the along the Atlantic coast and in the Gulf Coast, all of those cities like New Orleans and New Bern, Wilmington, Savannah, all those, around Savannah. You're looking at all those port towns that basically, we had little, dots where we tried to do what they call the Anaconda Plan and get everything around the Confederacy to strangle it. It was in those areas that they were that slaves were free, and then they become the basis for weird experiments. Like, can they build a community? Like, can they learn? Like people just in the States, they didn't know this stuff. Even if you were from the North, and even an abolitionist to a certain extent, you didn't understand that they could, live the way, or act certain ways. But it becomes the basis for, African Americans in the army in the U.S., which substantially decreases the time the fighting goes on. So, yeah, it only did it in certain places.
Number 3, Lindbergh was the first person to fly across the Atlantic. While Lucky Lindy won fame and fortune for his daring solo jaunt across the Atlantic in 1927, he was far from the first to cross the ocean by air. In fact, 2 British pilots, Alcock and Brown, had made the crossing years earlier in a repurposed RAF bomber. They flew from St. John's, Newfoundland to Galway, Ireland in just under 16 hours in 1919. That flight paved the way for commercial transatlantic aviation and made Lindbergh's future flight possible. Further, just a couple of weeks after the British duo had made their flight, the British airship R-34, with a couple of dozen crew and passengers on board, made a double crossing, taking about 4 days to cross both ways. In fact, by the time Lindbergh made his world-famous crossing, close to 80 men had already made the epic journey. His, however, was done entirely solo, and clocking in at almost 34 hours of straight flying time was a far more challenging and grueling feat.
That's the key word, is solo. Here in the States, people still do believe that Lindbergh was the first person to cross the Atlantic. This is a time of, the first this, the first that in an airplane, the first, whatever. Doing things in the air the first time, there's a whole bunch of this stuff going on. There's a thing, I believe, in the States. I'm not sure if it was in Europe, called barnstorming. It was people doing all sorts of things on an airplane, like playing tennis, and I don't know. It's crazy stuff. But it did show that one person, that was the only thing. It did show that one person could cross in, what was it, 30 some hours and change, 35, 34 hours. And I mean, it was just, another thing to celebrate. Yes, 2 people had done it many times, but one person staying awake did it, and that was fantastic, I guess. So, all right, hang with us here. This is from my British friends. Anything North American or United Statesian, whatever you want to call it, hang with us on this one.
Number 2. Custer's 7th Cavalry was wiped out at Little Bighorn. While many assume that Custer's entire command was wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn in June of 1876, the truth is that less than half of the 647 men under his command were killed in the famous battle. The reason for this was twofold. First, some of his men were assigned to drive and guard the lengthy wagon train that followed in the army's wake, and so were too far away at the time to be involved. And secondly, Custer had divided his command between himself and Major Reno in an effort to make a two-pronged attack. Reno's assault, which preceded Custer's by an hour or so, was driven off with heavy casualties.
There were, I don't mean to interrupt him, but there were 3. There were 3 separate divisions.
But most of it emerged from the battle intact. It was only those companies that rode with Custer, about 210 men in all, that were entirely wiped out.
Yes.
Number 1.
Okay, first of all, just to give you a heads up, Custer's not an idiot. And I know a lot of people are laughing, going, "Oh, this is going to be rich." But the truth of the matter is he was a very good cavalry officer during the American Civil War. He didn't attain this sort of level of, he was very famous by the end of the Civil War, and he was a very able cavalry leader, and he really was. And by the end of the war, like I said, he was extremely famous. So the next thing that people did who wanted to stay in the army was they would go out west and fight in the Indian Wars that we had, because that's another story. And he divided the 7th Cavalry into 3 separate wings, not 2. There were 3, and yeah, his was wiped out. His wing was wiped out. Yeah, and with it, his actually, I think, I know his brother Boston, and I can't remember the other brother's name, was with him, and a brother-in-law too, and they were all killed. So it was a family affair, and they got massacred. Now that was, I believe, ignorance to a certain extent, and it was one of the great Indian victories, Native American, indigenous, whatever you want to call it, victories, and it's true. But did the whole 7th Cavalry get wiped out? No. And if you ever see what's that movie called? We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson and the guy with the mustache. That's 7th Cavalry also. 7th Cavalry has a pretty decent history in the U.S.
The USA was chiefly responsible for defeating Germany in...
Oh, I can hear everyone over the pond is just like all at one time.
World War I and World War II. While American material and military support was imperative and likely ensured an eventual Allied victory, it was others who bore the brunt of the fighting against Germany in both wars. In World War I, the US was late to the show, not making it to France in significant numbers until late in 1917. It was the British and French who had been doing all of the fighting up until then, and had battered the Germans by the time the US entered the fray. In the Second World War, things were much the same, with American troops not arriving in theatre until very late in the war.
I disagree with that. I do disagree with that, just to give you a heads up.
While they fought largely rearguard actions in North Africa and Italy, by the time they landed in force in France in June 1944, the Germans were already reeling from the massive Soviet juggernaut that was rolling over them from the east. In fact, over 80% of all German casualties in World War II came on the Eastern Front. While it was the US that was chiefly responsible for defeating Japan in the Pacific, it was the Soviet Union that did most of the heavy lifting in Europe.
Okay, interesting point there, and I'm just going to keep it kind of factual, because I know some people tend to go hardcore one way or hardcore the other way. So to appease the US side of things and the British side of things, 1942, I don't believe was the end of the war. And talking about rearguard actions, I don't believe that necessarily being the truth. From what I understand of troop positioning and movements, there was a logistical error, and I say this thanks to the British Army, the 8th Army, and the army that landed in North Africa was quite helpful in getting the Americans up to speed in 1942. By 1943, we were much more of a force, on par, not necessarily ever on par with the British Army. A lot of the British were very professional soldiers, very good soldiers. Even the Germans said so. But, you're talking about the Italians that have been fighting, and they fought on our side. The Poles fought on, our collective side. They had been in it for a long time. And the other big part was that, we did fight in the Pacific. We were fighting 2 wars. So immediately we fought in the Pacific, but we had a Germany first policy. And so one of the first things we did immediately was use what we always use, which is our economy and our industrial capacity, and help much more substantially with the British Army. And it does not get talked about very much, but we supplied the first roll of Jeeps and a number of different military vehicles that we started producing went right to Russia. And it doesn't get talked about much. I mean, even Americans, I guess they don't like to admit this particular part of things, but we did send quite a bit of material to the Russians or the Soviet Union, and it's one of the more heavy reasons that people use for the Russians being able to stop the Germans when they did. Now, I don't know that it's the thing that stopped the Germans from taking over the Soviet Union, but that material that was sent over, and also, by the way, earlier from the British with those the northern route, that was a big help. But when they came in mass, that was huge. So anyway, that's sort of where I'm coming from. So I kind of feel like he's wrong with a lot of things in that particular case. But World War I would say, we're always the financial lenders of things. So it is what it is. Okay. All right, guys. Take it easy. Have a good one. Don't forget to leave a comment down below if you want to become a member. Become a member. I think it's a great thing. You can see all the other videos that just didn't make it in here. They're not necessarily history, or they're whatever. And there's some merch. And otherwise, please subscribe. I noticed a lot of you, really aren't. And if you could share it out, that'd be great. All right. Take it easy. Bye-bye now.